stayed silent for years because of my accent. Narrator Daniel. I stayed silent for years, not because I had nothing to say, not because I didn't know English, but because the moment I opened my mouth, I could feel it coming. That pause, that look, that slight change in people's faces. It never happened loudly. No one laughed. No one openly insulted me. But I could feel it the moment they heard my accent. I learned English for years. I passed exams. I read books. I understood everything. But my accent followed me like a shadow. Every sentence I spoke carried it, and every time it appeared, I felt smaller. So I stopped talking. In meetings, I stayed quiet even when I knew the answer. In classrooms, I avoided eye contact. On phone calls, my heart raced before the first word. People thought I was shy. Some thought I wasn't confident. Some thought I wasn't smart. The truth was worse. I was afraid that the moment I spoke, my accent would speak louder than my words. And then one day, in a room full of people, I stayed silent again. But this time, that silence cost me something I can never take back. Segment 1. Narrator Daniel. I did not stop speaking English all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, almost politely, one small moment at a time, each moment teaching me that silence was safer than being heard. When I first learned English, I was proud. I memorized vocabulary. I practiced grammar. I watched movies with subtitles. I repeated sentences in front of the mirror. I believed that one day I would speak confidently like the people I listened to online, but no one warned me about accents. The first time I noticed it was in a classroom. The teacher asked a question. I knew the answer. My hand went up. I spoke. The sentence was correct, grammatically perfect, but the room reacted in a way I did not expect. Not laughter, not mockery, just a pause. The teacher tilted her head slightly. A few students looked at each other. Someone in the back smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just enough to make me aware of myself. The teacher nodded and moved on. The moment ended. But something inside me stayed open. After class, no one said anything directly. No one told me my accent was bad. No one insulted me. And somehow that silence hurt more than open criticism. Because silence lets your mind create its own conclusions. I replayed my voice in my head for days. The way I pronounced certain sounds, the rhythm of my sentences, the way my accent revealed where I came from before my words could explain who I was. From that day I became careful about when I spoke, careful about how much I said, careful about who was listening. I started choosing silence even when I knew the answer. I convinced myself that listening was better than speaking, that being quiet was a sign of intelligence, that confident people did not need to talk all the time. But deep down I knew the truth. I was afraid that my accent made me sound less capable. In group discussions, I waited until someone else said what I was thinking. In meetings, I spoke only when directly asked. On phone calls, I kept my answers short. Yes, no, I understand. People began to describe me in ways that did not feel true. Quiet, shy, reserved, serious. No one knew that inside my head, sentences were forming constantly. Opinions, ideas, questions. But my accent stood like a wall between my thoughts and the world. At home alone, my English sounded fine, sometimes even good. I practiced speaking out loud. I recorded myself. I corrected my pronunciation. I worked hard. But the moment another person entered the space, my throat tightened. Accent is a strange thing. It is not a mistake. It is not wrong. But it carries history. It carries identity. And when people react to it, even subtly, it can make you feel exposed. I began to associate speaking English with risk of being misunderstood, risk of being judged, risk of confirming every insecurity I had ever carried. So I chose silence. I told myself I was waiting until my accent improved. I told myself I would speak more once I sounded better. I told myself this was temporary. Years passed. Silence became a habit, a comfort, a prison. Opportunities came and went quietly. Group projects, presentations, leadership roles. I stayed in the background watching others move forward while I stayed safe. Safe but invisible. One evening, I sat in a cafe working on my laptop. A group nearby was discussing a project in English. They spoke imperfectly, they interrupted each other, they corrected themselves openly, and no one seemed embarrassed. I listened closely. Their accents were different, some strong, some light, some mixed, yet no one paused when they spoke. No one hesitated, no one apologized for how they sounded, and I felt something heavy in my chest. I realized something painful. I was not silent because my accent was bad. I was silent because I believed it made me less worthy of being heard. That belief did not come from one moment. It came from many small reactions, many pauses, many looks I interpreted as judgment. The worst part was not that others noticed my accent. It was that I began to notice it before they did. I judged myself before anyone else had the chance. That night, as I walked home, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. How much of my life have I muted because of how I sound? The answer scared me, and that fear was about to follow me into a moment that would force me to choose between staying silent forever or finally letting my voice exist as it was. Segment 2. Narrator Daniel. The moment that proved how much silence had taken from me did not arrive dramatically. There was no argument, no confrontation, no public embarrassment. It arrived quietly, the way most life-changing losses do, almost politely. So polite that at first I did not even recognize it as loss. It happened during a group project meeting. There were 6 of us sitting around a table. Laptops open, papers scattered. Everyone was speaking English, fast, casual, confident. I had prepared more than anyone in that room. I knew the topic deeply. I had written notes. I had ideas that could improve the project significantly. But my accent sat in my chest like a warning sign. Every time I thought about speaking, my mind jumped ahead to the moment after the sentence. The pause, the reaction, the look. I imagined someone repeating my words slowly, or correcting my pronunciation, or smiling politely while not taking me seriously, so I waited. I waited for someone else to say something close to my idea. When they did, I nodded. When they didn't, I stayed quiet anyway. I told myself I could speak later. I told myself it wasn't the right moment. The meeting ended. As we packed up our things, the group decided roles. One person would lead the presentation, one would explain the main concept, one would handle questions. I watched as names were assigned, mine was not mentioned. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I preferred working behind the scenes. I told myself leadership was not important to me. But when I walked out of that room, something inside me collapsed. I had allowed silence to choose for me again. A few days later, I found out that the person chosen to explain the main concept had used my exact idea, word for word, structure for structure. It was something I had written in my notes but never said out loud. He didn't steal it. He had simply arrived at a similar conclusion later. But it didn't matter. The result was the same. My silence erased my presence. I watched the presentation from the audience. The explanation was good, but I knew I could have explained it better, not because my English was perfect, but because I understood the idea deeply, and that realization burned quietly inside me. No one in the room knew this. No one could, because I had chosen silence again. That was the first time I understood the true cost of hiding my accent. It wasn't just confidence I was losing, it was visibility, recognition, growth. Later that evening, I sat alone and replayed the meeting again and again. Not the mistakes, not the fear, the moments where I chose not to speak. Silence felt safe, but it was stealing my future slowly. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how this pattern repeated everywhere. In class discussions, in networking events, in casual conversations. People who spoke, even imperfectly, were remembered. People who stayed quiet were forgotten, and I was becoming very easy to forget. One afternoon, I received an email about an opportunity. A small internship, nothing extraordinary. But it required communication, team discussions, weekly presentations. I read the email several times. My heart wanted to apply. My fear answered first, what if they judge my accent? What if I can't express myself clearly? What if they don't take me seriously? I closed the email without replying. That night, I couldn't sleep. The question from earlier returned stronger. How much of my life am I muting because of how I sound? I realized something deeply uncomfortable. My accent had not ruined my opportunities. My silence had. The accent was just the excuse. I thought about the cafe conversation, the group with different accents speaking freely. I thought about the meeting where my idea disappeared because my voice never existed. And slowly, painfully, the truth settled in. People do not remember the person with the cleanest pronunciation. They remember the person who speaks. That realization hurt more than any judgment ever could. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror again. I listened to my own voice carefully, not to fix it, not to judge it, but to accept it. This was my voice. This was how I sounded. This was how my ideas would reach the world. And for the first time, I asked myself a different question. What if my accent is not the problem? What if hiding it is? That question did not remove my fear, but it weakened it just enough to let another thought appear. What if I speak anyway? I did not know then that this thought would lead me into a moment far more uncomfortable than anything I had experienced before. A moment where silence would no longer be an option. A moment where my accent would be heard clearly by people who mattered. And whether I liked it or not, my voice was about to step into the light. Segment 5. Narrator Daniel. The turning point did not make me fearless. It made me aware of how fear worked, aware of how it lived inside me, aware of the way it controlled my decisions without ever raising its voice. But awareness alone is not freedom. It is only the beginning of it. In the days that followed, I kept noticing something subtle. Every time I faced a situation where English was required, my fear appeared, but it did not feel as strong as before. It no longer controlled the entire room. It stood in the corner, watching me, waiting to see what I would do. And each time I chose to speak, even if I stumbled, even if my voice shook, the fear stepped back a little more. One afternoon, I experienced a moment that revealed how much I had changed. I was walking across campus when I heard someone call my name. It was the professor from the group discussion. He waved me over and asked if I could help a new student understand the assignment. My first reaction was instinctive. The old fear tried to rise. The old voice whispered, "What if you mess up? What if he thinks you're not good enough?" But the whisper felt weaker than ever before. I nodded and walked toward the student. He looked nervous. He held his textbook awkwardly and kept adjusting his backpack strap. When I spoke, his shoulders relaxed a little. He listened closely. I explained the assignment slowly, choosing simple words, giving examples, making sure he understood. When he finally nodded confidently, I felt something I had never felt before. I felt capable, not perfect, not fluent, just capable, and capability is the foundation of confidence. Later that evening, I sat in my room thinking about what had happened. Helping someone else had changed me more than any exercise, any practice session, any mirror conversation. I realized something meaningful. Fear becomes smaller when your purpose becomes bigger. The next day brought another test, a real one. I needed to ask a question in English at the department office, something I had avoided for months because it required speaking to someone face to face. In the past, I would have waited or emailed or found another way, but this time I walked straight to the office. My heart was still beating fast. My palms felt warm. The fear was still there. But I did not turn around. When my turn came, I walked up to the desk. The staff member greeted me politely. I responded. My voice was steady enough, not strong, but present. I asked my question. She answered without any sign of confusion or frustration. She understood me clearly. The entire exchange lasted barely 30 seconds. But when I walked out of that office, it felt like I had stepped out of a prison I built myself. Confidence does not arrive in a single moment. It arrives in small moments that accumulate quietly. A few days later, something even more surprising happened. I was invited to join a small study group. In the old days, I would have found a reason to say no. Study groups meant speaking. Speaking meant fear. Fear meant silence. But now something inside me wanted to try. The first meeting was slow for me. I spoke only when necessary. My sentences were short. I paused often. But I stayed. I did not run away. I let myself exist in that space without expecting perfection. The second meeting was easier. I contributed more. I asked a question. I answered one, two. In the third meeting, I spoke naturally, without worrying about how I sounded. Sometimes I made mistakes. No one cared. No one even noticed. They cared about the conversation, not the grammar inside it. And that was when I understood something crucial. People do not judge your English as harshly as you judge yourself. Once, after the fourth meeting, a classmate approached me and said something simple. "You explain things clearly. It's easy to understand you." I did not know how to respond at first. I had never seen myself that way. But hearing that sentence shifted something deep inside me. I had spent years believing that my English was a burden. Now I was hearing that it was helping someone. Later that night, as I walked home, I realized how much life I had missed because of fear. I had avoided opportunities, I had avoided conversations, I had avoided friendships, all because I believed I was not good enough to speak. But now the world felt different, not easier, but more open. That evening I recorded myself again. This time I did not judge the sound, I listened for something else. Progress. And it was there, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. My pauses were shorter, my tone was steadier, My sentences flowed more naturally. Fear had not left me, but it no longer defined me. As I turned off the recorder, I looked at my reflection in the dark window. And for the first time, I saw a version of myself I had hoped to become for years. Someone willing to speak, someone willing to try, someone willing to stand on the other side of fear. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of the real transformation. The deeper layers of fear were still waiting for me, and I was ready to face them. Segment 6. Narrator. Daniel, confidence is not a finish line. It is a place you return to again and again, each time with a slightly different version of yourself. By the time I reached this stage of my journey, I understood that fear does not disappear because you fought it once. It returns. It tests you. It waits for moments when you are tired, stressed, uncertain. But something had changed inside me. I was no longer running from those moments. I was walking into them slowly but willingly. One experience made this clearer than anything else. It was a busy morning in the campus cafeteria. The place was filled with noise, people talking, laughing, ordering food, English everywhere. In the past, this kind of environment made me shrink. I would keep my head down, order quickly, avoid eye contact, and escape as soon as I could. But that day I stood in line without the old panic building in my chest. In front of me stood a group of international students. They were discussing an assignment in English, stumbling through sentences, searching for words, laughing at their own mistakes, but something about them caught my attention. They were trying openly, without shame, without silence. It reminded me of who I used to be and who I no longer wanted to be. When it was my turn to order, I spoke clearly, slowly, calmly. The cashier understood me immediately. There was no confusion, no awkward pause, no panic, just a normal human exchange. A moment that meant nothing to the world, but everything to me. As I sat down with my food, I replayed the moment and realized how far I had come. Small victories like this were becoming common. But a real test arrived later that afternoon. I had a meeting with a group for a class project. This group included one student known for speaking extremely fast. He wasn't rude. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He simply had a natural speed that made conversations feel like a race. In past semesters, I avoided interacting with him because every sentence he said made me feel 3 steps behind. But now I had no choice. I had to face him. The meeting began with introductions, ideas, and suggestions flying around the table. His speed hit me immediately. Sharp sentences, quick movements, fast transitions. For the first few minutes, the old fear tried to return. It whispered that I was too slow, too unsure, too inexperienced to keep up. But I took a breath, and instead of trying to match his speed, I focused on something else, understanding the idea, not the pace. When it was my turn to speak, I did not try to sound like him. I did not try to speak fast. I did not try to prove anything. I simply spoke at my natural pace, clear, calm, controlled. Everyone listened, even him. At one point, he asked me a direct question. The old version of me would have panicked. My mind would have gone blank. My voice would have died. But this time, I asked him to repeat it. Not apologetically, not nervously, just clearly. Could you repeat the last part? He repeated it. Slower this time. And I understood him. That simple interaction taught me something powerful. Confidence is not about matching other people. It is about knowing yourself, knowing your pace, knowing your voice, and trusting it. After the meeting ended, he walked beside me on the way out. He said something I never expected. "You speak clearly. I like how you explain things. Makes it easy to follow." I did not know how to respond at first. Compliments about my English always felt unreal, as if they were meant for someone else. But the sincerity in his voice made it impossible to ignore. That evening, I reflected on everything: the cafeteria, the meeting, the confidence, the calmness. And I realized that I had reached a stage I never believed possible. I was functioning in English without fear, controlling every movement. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but freely. Later that night, I received a message from the study group asking if I could explain a concept again because they understood it better when I spoke. That message hit me harder than any praise. It was proof that my voice, this same voice I had doubted for years, was helping others. I sat on my bed, letting the moments sink in. Every step I had taken, every small risk, every shaky sentence had brought me here. And for the first time, I believed I belonged in the language I once feared. But a journey was not finished. There was still a deeper layer of fear left to face, a moment ahead that would test everything I had learned, a moment that would either break me or finally free me. And that moment was coming soon. Segment 5. Narrator Daniel. There was a time when every sentence I spoke in English ended with an apology. Sometimes out loud, sometimes only in my head. Sorry for my pronunciation, sorry for my pace, sorry for taking space. I carried that apology like a reflex, so natural that I barely noticed it. As I began speaking more regularly, something uncomfortable surfaced. I realized how deeply that habit had shaped my identity. I did not just speak with an accent, I spoke as if my accent required forgiveness. It showed in my posture, in my tone, in the way I softened my voice before every sentence. I would start speaking and immediately lower my expectations of how seriously others should take me. That habit had protected me from disappointment for years, but now it was holding me back. One afternoon, during a group discussion, I noticed it clearly. I shared an idea and finished it with a small phrase I had used countless times before. Sorry if that doesn't make sense. The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have, not because the idea was unclear, but because the apology did not belong there. A classmate looked at me and said something that stayed with me. It made sense. You don't need to apologize. The comment was not harsh. It was calm, almost casual. But it shook me because it exposed a belief I had never questioned. I believed my accent made my thoughts less valuable. That belief had never been spoken aloud. It had grown quietly inside me over years of hesitation and silence. But now it stood in front of me, clear and uncomfortable. That night I replayed the moment again and again. Not the discussion, the apology. I realized how often I had minimized myself before anyone else had the chance to judge me. When you apologize for your voice, you teach others how to hear you. The next day, I made a quiet decision. I would stop apologizing for how I sounded, not because my accent disappeared, but because it did not need permission to exist. This was harder than speaking itself. The first time I caught myself, I was ordering coffee. The barista asked a follow-up question. I answered and almost added an apology automatically. I stopped mid-sentence. The moment felt strange, exposed, but also honest. Nothing happened. The coffee was made. The exchange ended. Life continued. The more I resisted apologizing, the more I noticed how unnecessary it had been. People were not waiting for me to excuse myself. They were waiting for me to finish my thought. A few days later, I experienced something new. I spoke in a group discussion without apologizing, no softening phrases, no disclaimers, just my idea stated clearly. The reaction was different. People responded directly, they asked questions, they built on my point, they treated my contribution as something solid. That was when I understood something deeply important. Confidence is not about sounding perfect, it is about sounding present. Your accent does not weaken your message, your hesitation does. As I continued speaking, I noticed another shift. People began to seek my input, not dramatically, but naturally. A quick question here, a follow up there, small signals that I had not imagined before. I was no longer invisible. One afternoon, I helped a classmate prepare for a presentation. As we practiced, he stopped and said something that surprised me. "You explain things very clearly. I like your pace." Pace. For years, I believed my slow speaking was a weakness. Now someone was telling me it helped them understand better. That moment reframed everything. What I thought was a flaw had become a strength. Accents slow you down, and slowing down can bring clarity. That realization stayed with me as I continued to speak more freely. I no longer rushed to hide my accent. I let it exist. I let it shape my rhythm. I let it be part of my identity. This did not make everyone suddenly admire me. Some people still interrupted. Some still spoke faster than I could follow. Some conversations were still uncomfortable. But something inside me had changed. I no longer believed silence was safety. Silence was absence. The following week, I was asked to share my experience with another student who was struggling with English. As I listened to him apologize for his accent, I heard my old voice in his words. I told him something I had only recently learned myself. Your accent is not the problem. Apologizing for it is. His expression shifted, not because he suddenly believed me, but because someone had finally said it out loud. Walking home that evening, I realized how much of my journey had been about unlearning shame, unlearning hesitation, unlearning the belief that my voice needed approval. I was not fearless, but I was no longer silent, and the final lesson was still ahead. The moment when I would understand that my accent was not something to overcome, it was something to carry forward. Segment 6. Narrator Daniel. Acceptance did not arrive as confidence, it arrived as exhaustion. I grew tired of fighting a part of myself that had never actually harmed anyone. My accent had not broken conversations, it had not closed doors, it had not made people reject me. The struggle came from resisting it, from trying to sound like someone I was not. For years, I chased a version of English that did not belong to me. I practiced copying accents, I replayed videos, I repeated sounds again and again, hoping one day my voice would erase its origin. I believed that once my accent disappeared, my fear would disappear with it, but that day never came. What did come was a moment of clarity, a quiet one. It happened late at night while I was listening to a podcast. The speaker had a strong accent, stronger than mine. He spoke slowly, deliberately, with clear intention, and people were listening, not patiently, not politely. They were engaged. I paused the audio and sat there for a long time. For the first time, I asked myself a question without anger or shame. Why am I trying to sound like someone else? That question changed the direction of my journey. The next day, I stopped correcting my accent aggressively. I stopped forcing sounds that felt unnatural. Instead, I focused on clarity, stressing the right words, pausing naturally, speaking with intention rather than imitation. And something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. Speaking no longer felt like acting, it felt like communication. I was no longer performing English, I was using it. In conversations, I noticed how much energy I used to spend monitoring myself, watching reactions, anticipating judgment, adjusting mid sentence. That energy disappeared when I stopped fighting how I sounded. My voice became steadier. Not smoother, steadier. People responded differently too, not because my accent vanished, but because my hesitation did. One afternoon, during a discussion, someone interrupted me mid sentence. It used to happen before, and before it would silence me completely. But this time I did something new. I continued. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I simply finished my sentence. The interruption faded. The room adjusted. The moment passed. That small action felt powerful. It showed me that respect is not demanded through perfect pronunciation. It is earned through presence. As weeks passed, my accent stopped feeling like a spotlight. It became background noise, something I noticed less and less, something that did not define the conversation. One evening, I attended a small networking event. In the past, I would have stayed near the walls, listening silently. That night, I joined a conversation willingly. I introduced myself. I asked questions. I shared my experiences. At one point, someone asked me where I was from. I answered honestly, without tension, without apology. They smiled and said they liked how thoughtfully I spoke. That word stayed with me. Thoughtfully. Not clearly, not perfectly, thoughtfully. I realized then that accents often bring depth. They slow speech, they add intention, they carry experience, and those qualities matter more than sounding native ever will. Later that night, I thought about all the years I had stayed silent, the opportunities I had avoided, the conversations I had missed, and I felt something new, not regret, forgiveness. I forgave myself for hiding. I forgave myself for choosing silence when fear felt overwhelming. I forgave myself for believing I needed to erase my voice to deserve space. That forgiveness unlocked something deeper. Pride, not loud pride, quiet pride. Pride in having walked through fear slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. The next time I spoke in public, I did not think about my accent at all. I focused on my message. I focused on the people listening. I focused on connection. And that was when I understood the final truth of my journey. Fluency is not about sounding native. Fluency is about being understood without hiding. My accent was not a problem to solve. It was proof that I had learned something difficult. It was evidence of effort, of growth, of courage. I had spent years trying to escape my voice. Now I was finally standing inside it, and that acceptance prepared me for the final moment, the moment where I would see my story reflected in someone else, the moment where my voice would become a bridge instead of a barrier. Segment 7. Narrator Daniel. I did not expect my journey to turn outward. For a long time, everything had been internal. My fear, my silence, my slow steps forward. I believed the story would end once I learned to accept my accent. But growth has a way of asking more from you when you least expect it. The moment came through someone else. He was new, quiet, always sitting near the edge of the room. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. His English was careful, his accent heavy. He apologized often, too often. The kind of apology that comes from someone who already expects rejection. I noticed him because I recognized myself. One afternoon after class, he waited until most people had left. He approached me slowly, as if unsure whether he was allowed to speak. He asked a simple question about an assignment. His sentence broke in the middle, then restarted. He looked down while speaking, as if preparing for interruption. I listened without rushing him. When he finished, he said something that stopped me. Sorry for my accent. The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they surprised me, but because they came from a place I had lived in for years, a place where your voice feels like a burden you must explain before using. I answered his question first, calmly, clearly. Then I said something I had only recently learned how to believe. You don't need to apologize for that. He looked up, confused, as if the idea itself was unfamiliar. We talked for a few minutes about the assignment, about the class, about how difficult it can be to speak when you feel everyone is listening. I did not give advice. I did not try to sound confident. I simply shared my experience, the silence, the fear, the years I spent hiding. His posture changed as I spoke. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His eyes stayed up instead of on the floor. He told me he avoided speaking in class because people once laughed at how he pronounced a word. Just once, years ago. But that moment had followed him everywhere. I understood that kind of memory, how one small reaction can rewrite your behavior for years. I told him something honestly. They probably don't remember that moment, but you do. And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since. He nodded slowly, not because the pain disappeared, but because someone finally named it. Over the next few weeks, we spoke occasionally. Sometimes about class, sometimes about nothing important. Each time he apologized less. Each time his sentences became longer, not smoother, but braver. One day during a group discussion, he spoke up, just once. A short comment, his voice shook slightly, but he finished. No one reacted negatively. The conversation continued. After class, he smiled quietly, not proudly, relieved. That moment did something unexpected to me. I realized that my journey was no longer just mine. Every step I took through fear had created a path someone else could follow. My voice, the one I tried to erase for so long, was now doing something meaningful. It was permission for someone else to exist as they were. That realization reframed everything. My accent was not something I survived, it was something I could use, not as a lesson, not as a speech, but as proof. Proof that you do not need to wait until you sound perfect to speak. Proof that fear loses power when it is shared. Proof that silence can be broken gently. One evening as I walked home, I thought about how much energy I had spent trying to hide, and how little it had protected me. Silence had never made me safer. It had only made me smaller. Speaking had not erased fear, but it had made room for something stronger, connection. I began noticing how often people with accents listened more carefully, thought more deeply, spoke more intentionally, and I realized that the very thing we try to hide often carries the most value. My accent had shaped my patience. It had shaped my empathy. It had shaped the way I listened, Those were not weaknesses, they were strengths built through struggle. The final realization came quietly. I was no longer trying to get rid of my accent. I was no longer trying to sound like someone else. I was simply speaking as myself, and that was enough. One last moment remained. Not dramatic, not public, but deeply personal. A moment that would close the chapter I had lived in for years and open a new one. A moment where I would finally say the sentence I never allowed myself to believe. Segment 8. Narrator Daniel. The end of my story did not come with applause. It did not arrive with praise or validation from others. It arrived in a quiet moment, the kind that only you notice, the kind that reshapes how you see yourself without needing witnesses. It happened on an ordinary day. I was standing in line at a cafe waiting to order. The place was busy, voices overlapping, accents everywhere, people speaking quickly, imperfectly, naturally. Years ago, this scene would have tightened my chest. I would have rehearsed my order silently, choosing the safest words, preparing for the smallest misunderstanding. That day I did not rehearse. When it was my turn, I spoke, clearly, calmly, with my accent fully present. The barista understood me immediately. No repetition, no confusion, no pause. The interaction lasted seconds and disappeared into the noise of the cafe, but something inside me stayed. I walked away with my coffee and realized what had just happened, not the order, the absence of fear. For the first time, I had spoken without monitoring myself, without listening to my accent as I spoke, without adjusting my pace to protect myself. I had simply communicated. That realization hit me harder than any praise ever could. Later that afternoon, I sat alone and thought about the years I had spent silent. The meetings where I knew the answer but said nothing. The presentations I avoided. The opportunities I declined before anyone else could judge me. The apologies I carried in my voice for simply existing. I understood something then that I had not fully accepted before. Silence did not protect me. It erased me. And my accent was never the reason. Fear had been. That fear had once felt reasonable. It had kept me safe when I didn't know how to be brave. It had helped me survive moments I wasn't ready to face. But now it no longer belonged in my life. I had outgrown it that night. I opened the notebook I had used for years, the same one where I once practiced pronunciation obsessively, crossing out words that didn't sound right, rewriting sentences until they felt acceptable. I flipped through the pages slowly. I saw effort. I saw discipline. I saw persistence. I did not see failure. On the last page, I wrote a sentence I never allowed myself to write before. My accent is part of my voice. My voice deserves space. It was not a promise. It was a statement. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how differently I moved through conversations. I did not rush. I did not shrink. I did not apologize. When someone asked me to repeat something, I did, without shame. When I didn't understand a phrase, I asked, without fear. Conversations became exchanges instead of performances. I also noticed something unexpected. People responded more warmly, not because my accent softened, but because my presence strengthened. Confidence, I learned, is not volume. It is permission. Permission to exist as you are. One evening, the student I had spoken with earlier sent me a message. He told me he spoke in class again, louder this time, longer. He said he still felt nervous, but he no longer apologized for his accent. He thanked me for showing him that it was possible. I read the message slowly. That was the moment I knew my journey was complete. Not because I had conquered fear forever, not because my accent disappeared, but because my silence no longer defined me. I had turned something that once limited me into something that connected me to others. That is the quiet power of acceptance. I still have an accent. I always will. But now, when I speak, I know something I did not know for years. My voice carries effort, my voice carries experience, my voice carries truth. And truth does not need to sound perfect to be heard. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, I want you to hear this clearly. Your accent is not the enemy. Your silence is. You do not need to wait until you sound different. You do not need to erase where you came from. You do not need permission to speak. Your voice already belongs in the room, and the moment you stop hiding it, everything begins to change. Subscribe now. Join the Bright World English Academy family and let's start your English learning journey together.